Yeah, so hi everyone. So my name's Jake Aylmer. I'm a postdoctoral research assistant at the University of Reading in the UK. So I work in Danny Feltham's research group as part of the Centre for Polar Observation and Modelling. Um, so the work I'm going to present today is a short project that I worked on sort of a couple of years ago now. It was actually part of this big project at the University of Reading called Arctic Summertime Cyclones: Dynamics and Sea Ice Interaction. Um, so this is a sort of collaboration between some atmospheric researchers at Reading and various other institutions in the UK, um, including the British Antarctic Survey. And the project was about the sort of atmospheric dynamics associated with Arctic cyclones. So there's a little diagram on the right there from the project proposal, just sort of listing the various aims of that project. So this project involved a field campaign, which was in collaboration with some researchers from the US as well. So it's part of the Thin Ice Field campaign, which you may have heard about. So there was obviously a lot of measurements taking of properties of Arctic cyclones during this campaign, and also the properties of the sea ice and ocean surface below the cyclones during their development. So there's potentially a lot of useful data has come out of that field campaign. But the part that I actually worked on, and what I'm going to talk about today, was one of the work packages where we actually looked at modeling the impact of cyclones on sea ice, particularly through the lens of these things called very rapid sea ice loss events, or VRILs, as they're sometimes called. So I'm going to show a bit about that. So first of all, what are very rapid ice loss events? Well, as the name implies, they are large reductions in sea ice extent that occur on short timescales of a few days to perhaps a few weeks. So that's a bit of a qualitative, sort of vague definition. In a few slides' time, I'll show how we actually define those in an objective way. But just to illustrate the example, I'm showing an example of a very rapid ice loss event that occurred in the real world. And this is one that you may well be familiar with. So 2012 is, of course, if you're a sea ice scientist, you will know that this is the year of the record minimum Arctic sea ice extent in September. You may also know that in August of 2012, there was a very large-scale, long-lived and intense cyclone that was called, what was later dubbed the Great Arctic Cyclone. And this cyclone coincided with a very rapid sea ice loss event. So on the figure here, I'm showing two snapshots of the sea ice concentration taken from passive microwave observations on two dates, so the 1st of August and the 14th of August 2012. And so if you just look at the sea ice concentration between those two dates, you can see this dramatic reduction in the sea ice extent in the region of the sort of East Siberian Chukchi Sea, so here and here. Over the top of this plot on the right, I've plotted the track of the Great Arctic Cyclone, which we diagnosed from reanalysis data. So the cyclone came across from this direction, passed over the ice during this time period. As I said, it was very long-lived, very intense, and bringing strong winds over the ice. And so a lot of studies at the time and to this day have analysed this event. And many studies are saying that the cyclone contributed quite substantially to this rapid ice loss event. But even though this is a very intense cyclone and a very large example of a very rapid ice loss event, there are still some studies which disagree on the extent to which the cyclone actually influenced the sea ice change. Nevertheless, this kind of example has led some studies to suggest that there could be a strong link between cyclones and very rapid ice loss events. But you may ask, well, why do we care about the very rapid ice loss events in the first place? Well, there's two good reasons. So one of them is that if we look at operational forecast models, these VRAs are not very well represented. So I'm just showing here an example of a plot from a 2022 study by McGraw et al. Um, and essentially what they did was they analyzed different forecast models. So that's those listed here in the bottom right. Um, and they analyzed the forecast skill of the sea ice for days where you have a rapid ice loss event and compared that to days where you don't have a rapid ice loss event. And so that's this ratio R here, which is what they're plotting. And so when R is larger than 1, that means that the forecast skill is lower compared to a non-rapid ice loss event. And so I've just picked out a couple of their examples from their figure here, and you see that at these short lead times of a few days, the error in the forecast of rapid ice loss events is in some cases 2 times the error of just your regular sea ice forecast. So in this study, they also analyzed the 2012 event, which I mentioned on the previous slide. And they found that actually very few models actually got the right magnitude of the sea ice decline during that event, even though the cyclone itself was actually fairly well forecast. So that's one reason why we might care about these VRILs. But another reason, if you're not so interested in the sort of operational timescale, is there's actually, as you might expect, there's a link between these short timescale rapid ice loss events and the larger timescale interannual changes in sea ice. So here I'm picking out another recent paper from Wang et al. 2020. So this is quite a busy figure, but essentially what they're showing here. So the green line is, you might recognize the September sea ice extent time series. The orange is the same thing, but it's been detrended. And then the black bars behind it are showing the number of rapid ice loss events in the summer. So they analyzed June to September, just as a function of time. So it's just the number. And what that you actually kind of see is that there's a correlation between particularly the anomaly in the September sea ice extent and the number of these rapid ice loss events that occur in the year. So there's this link here between the shorter synoptic timescale and the larger interannual timescale. So perhaps if we understand better what causes the very rapid ice loss events, that might help us being able to predict, for example, if we have an upcoming minimum in the September extent. So here's just kind of an outline of what I'm going to show for the results. So as I said before, previous studies have suggested that there could be a substantial role of cyclones in driving these very rapid ice loss events. But this is often based on extreme cases, such as the 2012 case that I showed at the beginning, and others. So what we kind of wanted to do in this work was to analyze what extent viriles in general are associated with cyclones. So rather than just picking out specific cases where we know there's a cyclone and looking at the impact on the sea ice, let's analyze the viriles by themselves first, so objectively identify them, look at the drivers, and then see whether they are associated with cyclones or not. And so the way we do that is we take a model simulation. So we've used our local version of the sea ice model CICE, which I'll talk a bit about in the next slide. And we run an atmosphere forced simulation for this time period, so the period for which we have observations. That gives us a large number of very rapid ice loss events that we can analyze. And so what I'm going to show is I'll just talk a bit about the methodology a bit more, so say a bit more about the model, how we identify the rapid ice loss events. And then I'm going to show a few examples of the viriles that occur in the simulation. We'll look at whether they're associated with cyclones or not. Then I'll talk a little bit more about how we've identified what the driving factors are and whether we can kind of generalize the case studies to say something more general about whether there is this association or not. So on this slide, I'm just giving an overview of the model setup that we have. So in the middle box here, I'm just summarizing what is different about our sea ice model that has not in the past typically been included in sea ice models that are used in, say, forecast models or climate models. So the model is based on the SICE sea ice model, but we've included in our sort of developmental version a few additional parameterizations of marginal ice zone processes that are, as I said, have not typically been included in models before and are only now starting to make their way in. So melt ponds based on the topography of the sea ice, so that's actually starting to come into it's part of the UK model now, but this when we did this work, it was still a relatively novel aspect. We have a prognostic flow size distribution, so typically in sea ice models, flow size is fixed. Here we actually have a prognostic flow size that evolves in response to processes such as lateral melting. And also wave breakup. We have a simple wave breakup scheme in the model. And also form drag. So this is referring to the exchange coefficients between the surface and the atmosphere and the bottom surface of the ice in the ocean. So typically those drag coefficients, again, are assumed to be uniform, which is, if you look at observationally derived estimates, that's definitely not the case. So our model is coupled to a simple ocean mixed layer model, and then we drive the model with atmospheric forcing from atmospheric reanalysis. So we've used a modified version of the JRA55 reanalysis. Basically, it's a version of JRA55 which has been adjusted to better match observations in certain respects. We actually did some analysis of different reanalyses to determine what was the most appropriate forcing for a sea ice model, and we did actually come to the conclusion this was the best, with other reanalyses leading to too many biases. So we have our optimum setup of our model. So we run our simulation for a 45-year period spanning 1979 to 2023. And from our model simulation, we get obviously the sea ice extent itself, from which we can calculate viriles, and I'll explain how we do that on the next slide. Of course, the advantage of using the model is that we also get the diagnostics from the model, which will help us in our analysis, of course, which is something that we can't really do as well with observations. In terms of the cyclones, well, we're forcing our model with atmospheric reanalysis. So what we actually did was well, I say our atmospheric colleagues kindly carried out a vorticity tracking on the reanalysis data. So rather than, we're not just looking at the surface wind, for example, to identify the cyclones, we're actually doing a proper tracking of vorticity in the mid-troposphere, which is a way of identifying and tracking the cyclones. So then we have basically our two data sets. We're going to start by looking at the viriles, but then when we start identifying them, we can see whether the timing and the locations match up to any cyclone tracks. So here's how we identify viriles. So this is not something that we've come up with. This is the method I'm going to explain here. It's basically we're just using the same method that's been used in prior literature. So for example, the Wang et al. Paper that I mentioned earlier. So the basic idea is that firstly you calculate sea ice extent, and we do this for the whole Arctic, but we're primarily interested in the regional scale. So the way we do this is we simply divide the Arctic up into different sectors based on just some boundaries which divide it up into the main sort of surrounding seas, and we calculate sea ice extent in each sector from daily data. And then what we want to do is we need to detrend the data, and not just detrend it, because obviously there's a long-term trend which we're not interested in, but we also want to remove the seasonal cycle. And the reason for that is that, of course, if you have a rapid ice loss event that's occurring in, say May, you already have a background decline of the sea ice at that point, which is very different to, say, July, where it's typically at its strongest point. So we don't want to capture that. We just want to look at the deviations with respect to what you would typically expect the sea ice to be doing for the time of year and location that's being analysed. So that's the idea behind this. And basically what we do is we define a trend for each day of the year and remove that from our data. And this is done for the whole period, but I've just zoomed in on 1 year here so you can see. So we have our raw time series in the black. The red would be our seasonal trend. And then we remove that, and that leaves us with this residual time series in blue. And so that's what we analyze. And so if you look at this blue dip here, which occurs around the end of September, that would be an example of a rapid ice loss event, which we will actually look at in a moment, which is why I picked this year in particular. So in terms of actually identifying the viriles from this residual time series, basically what we do is we define a minimum time scale of 5 days, and we calculate a delta sea ice extent for 5 days. Basically, we calculate all possible 5-day changes from that blue time series. That gives us a nice smooth histogram. It's just very smooth because obviously it's all been detrended and there's no trends in there. And then the very rapid ice loss events are simply defined as anything in the top or the bottom 5% of that histogram. And as I say, that dip there at the end of the melt season in this year is an example of one that we'll look at. So let's finally look at an example of a rapid ice loss event simulated in the model. So on the left here, I'm showing change in sea ice concentration from the 22nd to the 30th of September 2018. So that's that dip that I showed on the previous slide. And so this is obviously end of September, so we expect sea ice to basically be growing at this time of year. And you see that is the case for most areas, but there is this red patch which indicates decreases in sea ice concentration in the sort of Kara Sea region. And that is what is being identified as a rapid ice loss event. We're comparing our model to observations here. Now, we don't make any claims that our model is perfect, but I think if we look at the general pattern of increase and decrease, it actually corresponds quite well. And obviously there's some biases in certain regions. But the fact that the model is generally picking up this increase and decreasing pattern around the edge of the sea ice gives us some confidence that the model is responding appropriately to the atmospheric forcing, which is what we're primarily interested in. So one thing that we can do with the model, which we can't do as easily with observations, at least not without being subject to lots of uncertainties, is that we can actually break down the changes in sea ice due to different processes. So for example, here I show this simple decomposition of the net change in sea ice due to thermodynamic processes and dynamic processes. As you can see, and perhaps not too surprising, in this particular event, most of the change in sea ice, at least in the area of the very rapid ice loss event, is driven by dynamics. Another thing you might notice is that whilst we do have this pattern of sea ice decrease, we also have on the westward side of it quite a large area of sea ice increase. And so that might be kind of suggesting a certain pattern of movement in the ice, which is a cyclonic pattern. And indeed, when we actually look at this event in more detail, we see that there is a cyclone track that is passing over the sea ice at this time. So I don't know how well the animation is going to show over screen sharing, but hopefully you can see this moving. So here I'm just basically animating the change in sea ice concentration that I showed from the model. So this is all model output here. And I've got my green cyclone track over the top. So, and then this is just sea level pressure contours, so dashed being negative anomaly. So what you can see is that when this animation just restarts now, initially the sea ice concentration is increasing everywhere as we expect. But when the cyclone reaches just north of Svalbard here, that's when we start to see this reversing sign of the change in sea ice concentration. So this is an example of a rapid ice loss event where it's very clear that there is a cyclone um, involved, and we have looked in this in more detail than I'm showing on this slide in terms of the diagnostics of the model. But I think you agree this one is a fairly clear-cut case. But we can look at other examples in the model. And so here I've shown an example of a virile with a cyclone, but we can also quite easily find examples of viriles that occur without a cyclone. So this is another example of a rapid ice loss event. This one occurs in July. There are no cyclone tracks at any location for this time period in the Arctic. So this one cannot possibly be associated with a cyclone. So on this plot, I've just added the sea ice edge contour in blue. So the virile itself is occurring in the where my pointer is here, so the sort of Kara Sea. So when it sort of gets to the end here, you can kind of see that the sea ice edge has retreated much further than it has everywhere else in the Arctic. And we find that this particular event is just driven by anomalous thermodynamic processes. And we'll look at that in more detail in the next slide. But the point for this at this stage is just to say that we can easily find events that are kind of similar in magnitude, both equally with and without cyclones. And further, we can find examples of cyclones that occur without any rapid ice loss events. So here I'm showing an animation of a cyclone track that comes through here over Fram Strait, and then it passes over the Arctic this way. It's following the green track. It sort of stays in this sort of Laptev area for sort of Laptev Kara area before basically dying away over this side of the Arctic. But there are no viriles here. Now you might notice that there's quite a lot of sea ice change over here in the Laptev sector, but actually most of this is occurring before the cyclone reaches this region. And the cyclone is actually quite weak by the time it gets here. The peak strength of this cyclone is when it's here over Svalbard. And this is actually a cyclone that was observed during the thin ice field campaign. So here's a few examples. Got what's coming next. Okay, yeah. So yeah, as I said, we haven't just done this kind of analysis where we've just plotted cyclone tracks and different viriles and sort of just judged by eye whether it's going to whether the cyclone is doing anything. We have actually looked in more detail at the processes. So coming back to my 2018 example, where we have what seems to be a clear role of the cyclone, just based on its timing and location, we can again come back to the model diagnostics and actually see whether how the sea ice is actually changing. And so here we've looked at the wind stress. And I think you can agree that this is just an average over the time period of the rapid ice loss event. And you can see that this matches up quite well. So this one is an example where it seems fairly straightforward. But here we've just been able to verify it using the model. And I mentioned that one of the things we want to do is not just focus on case studies, but actually try to generalize the results. So as I said, we have a 45-year simulation. We have something like 500 very rapid ice loss events. So what we try to do is to say, well, okay, let's look at them all and see whether this kind of explanation works for all of the very rapid ice loss events. So that's what I'm trying to do on the plot here. So here I'm just doing it for the Laptev sector, where we did this for other sectors as well. So basically what I'm doing is I'm plotting the magnitude of the very rapid ice loss event against the wind stress divergence. So that's this quantity here, averaged over the virile itself. And you see that in this case, it does kind of work. So there's this correlation between the virile magnitude and the wind stress. So can we do something similar for the other kinds of events? So this is the second example that I showed before. So this is the example of the rapid ice loss event that occurred without any cyclones present. And here we've used, rather than as I said, this event is driven by thermodynamics, not dynamics. So here, what we've done is we've used the surface energy balance. Now you might think, well, that's actually not a particularly useful quantity, but the 2 points here are, one, it does work in the same way. We have this correlation between the virile magnitude and the surface energy balance. And we tried to actually look at components of the surface energy balance. So you might say, well, for example, the downwelling long wave radiation or bottom melt or something like that. But actually, we couldn't pick out any individual components which worked in the same way as this. And so that's why we kind of left these particular events in this kind of more generalized way like this. So finally, just to say a bit more about the events in general in the model. So here I'm just plotting the similar to the figure I showed from Wang et al., the number of very rapid ice loss events in the model. So that's the solid black line with the colored points. We did the same thing for the passive microwave observations as well. That's the gray dashed line. So again, you can see again, although the model is not perfect, it is picking up the kind of year-to-year variability, and we do see, this is 2012, for example, where we see a peak in the number of events. Here, the interesting thing is that there's actually you might expect there to be an increasing trend in these viriles because, the sea ice is becoming more vulnerable, it's becoming more marginal. But there's not really any evidence of that in either the observations or the model. And there's also no real evidence of that, of any increasing trend in the cyclone counts either. So that was the yearly counts. So in this plot, we're looking at the seasonal distribution. So the bars here are basically just showing the distribution across the whole time period. So the whole 1979 to 2023, and the distribution within the season of when the rapid ice loss events occur in the model for the bars, and then observations in the dashed line. So again, our model is picking up the general characteristics of the viriles. But we have this interesting peak in July versus September. So one thing I didn't have a chance to talk about too much here was the color. So the color here represents whether the typical classification of the events are thermodynamic for red or dynamic for blue. So we have this peak of thermodynamically dominated events in the summer and dynamically dominated at the end of summer. Now you might say that's obvious, you would expect that. But keep in mind that we have, for this analysis, we have detrended everything. So the fact that it's just, it's warm in summer, it's not necessarily, it's been removed from the analysis. So we're looking at the anomaly relative to everything. And just finally, just coming back to the question of whether we can generalize the association between cyclones and viriles. Here I've just done some box plots of the virile rates divided into two categories first. So ones which are associated with a cyclone, ones which are not associated. That's left versus right. And then again, it's the red for thermodynamic and blue for dynamic. And what you see here is that these box plots generally overlap, which means that the cyclones, even the ones which are associated with cyclones, are not actually, and the cyclone is not really doing much to increase the virile magnitude. Okay, so I realize I'm coming up on time a bit here, so I think we'll just skip to the summary slide here. So the point of this work is to try and assess whether there's a general relationship between Arctic cyclones and the occurrence of very rapid sea ice loss events, so these short time scale rapid reductions in sea ice extent. And we've done this using our version of the sea ice model. So we found that actually only about 60%, which is more than half, but it's still not dramatically more than half of the simulated events actually occur in the presence of a cyclone at all. As I showed in the last box plots, we don't see much impact of cyclones on the virile magnitudes. And so this suggests, although there's obviously lots of caveats here, that the impact of cyclones may have been previously overestimated by focusing on extreme case studies such as the August 2012 And just to finish, the reason I decided to present this work here is because there's potential use of some of the outputs from the wider Arctic Summertime Cyclone project for this working group. So I mentioned briefly at the start that there's lots of data come out of the field campaign. And also as part of doing this work and as part of my ongoing work now, we are developing the MIZ physics in these sea ice models that we use. Yeah, so I think I'll stop there. And thank you very much for your attention.
Thank you, Jake. It was a really nice talk. Let's see, do we have questions for Jake?
I got one question, Ian. Jake, excellent talk. I liked it very much. We've been doing something similar in the Antarctic, just looking at the observations, and it's so great that you actually put together the model as well to look at that. One thing, I mean, I'm very intrigued by the fact that it's so difficult to discern the effect of the cyclones on normal weather conditions. I mean, exchanges at the surface balance. This is exactly what we found in Antarctic sea ice. So
Yeah.
because we made our point, and actually some of the reviewers didn't like it, that weather variability in certain regions in the Antarctic, particularly in the Weddell Sea, where you don't have the cyclones already generated, because it takes time for them to generate, because the cyclogenesis is very close, and you got more weather conditions and variability. So it seems like this is similar. You get, can you attribute the surface energy balance is linked to the atmospheric conditions? How can you discern when a cyclone takes over from, is it possible in your experience from the model?
No, so basically what we were trying to do is we were trying to just took all of our rapid ice loss events and we're just trying to broadly classify them. So we had the dynamic group and the thermodynamics group. For the thermodynamics group, we were just struggling to find anything. So we tried looking at downwelling long wave. We tried looking at not even going back to the atmospheric forcing, just looking at because we have the sea ice model. So we have I showed the breakdown into the sea ice change due to dynamics, due to thermodynamics. You can break those down again into basal melt, lateral melt, and top melt. Even that did not really work. So we sort of struggled a bit with the thermodynamic events. So yeah, we couldn't really find anything which was in the same way that the wind stress seemed to work for the events which were dynamically dominated.
Sorry, just to follow up.
Yeah.
I mean, my point is basically, do you think it's because the model doesn't take the thermodynamics, dynamics into properly? Because in the reality, we do see this continuous blending, and it's very difficult to separate them. We don't really know whether because the thermodynamics is basically 1D and the dynamics is 2D, and that's how it works in numerical models. And I wonder if we don't somehow miss some of it.
Right. Yeah. Yeah. I mean, it's hard to say. I mean, I thought the model is. I mean, I'm a modeler, so I would say that the model is probably doing the right thing. I mean, the thing that I noticed more about the impact of cyclones was that I think it might depend more on the nature of the cyclone, because the example I showed, the first one, the 2018 one, the cyclone, when it's at its point of most intensity, it's in the same place. Whereas the other case, which was the campaign case, it's at its point of most intensity, it's already moving. It's gone, so it's not there for long enough to really do anything. So I think that there's just so many different factors, and of course we've not really talked that much about the difference between seasons. You have differences in the underlying sea ice state itself, higher concentration versus and higher thickness and so on. I just think there are just so many factors. I think maybe trying to pick out one one explanation is not ever going to necessarily work with this.
Thank you.
I have a quick question, Jake, sort of about the broader context of the talk. I was struck when you showed your histogram of. By the way, I really enjoyed the talk and really nice analysis. I was struck by the histogram you showed of the 5-day changes and the SIE anomalies.
Oh, yeah.
You know, it was so kind of Gaussian looking.
Yeah.
It wasn't quite symmetric. I think it looked like the tail's a little bigger in terms of loss than gain. But my recollection from the original Ryle thing, which was this Holland et al. 2006 paper about CSM3, which I think had a lot more years, right? You had like 45 years and they had something like 700. They didn't have this in the paper, but it came out afterwards. It was really symmetric when you had all those between gain and loss. And I guess I'm just wondering, like, why focus on way out on one particular tail of the histogram? Like, you mentioned that the forecasts do worse in these Ryle years, but or times, but usually forecasts do worse on any extremes. Like, why not look at the other side of the histogram? And why not look at the histogram more holistically? Like, do the forecasts do worse at the 5% tail of sea ice loss than they do at the 5% tail of sea ice gain that probably occurs about as often?
I think that's a good point about the you know, the forecasts are going to do worse at the extremes anyway. That's a good point. Nevertheless, I do think it probably suggests that there is some shortcoming in the models, where I guess the point is just that at those extremes it becomes more apparent that there's a problem.
Maybe the tails are hardest to get, but why not look at the other tail? I mean, that's important for forecasts too.
Well, in my case, the other tail is not quite so relevant because the histogram that I'm showing is the 5-day changes, but it's from the detrended data. So, and also it's I think that this is the point I always keep forgetting to clarify. That histogram is not for the whole time of year. It's only for May to September. So the tail of the histogram at the other side is basically, it corresponds to reductions in sea ice that are less extreme than you would typically expect.
But sure,
I mean,
but are those also hard to forecast? I mean, granted, you're right. The trend makes the whole system not symmetric, and you've removed that.
yeah.
But is it hard to forecast? Is it similarly hard to forecast an extreme year where we just have way less ice loss than usual, or even as we often have in some years, superimposed on that trend? Sometimes we have a gain, right?
Yeah.
Are those?
Well, I mean, I don't know is the answer. I mean, we've just analysed the rapid ice loss events because it's an emerging thing that people are becoming interested in. And I think that the assumption is, in the context of the cyclones, that the cyclones tend to cause these reductions rather than gains. Although, of course, they can cause gains as well, because I mean, you have this. If the winds are going this way on the side where the winds are going into the ice pack, it's going to reduce, and on the other side, it may cause a sea ice expansion, as we see in some of these cases. So, so maybe you have a point there. But yeah, I mean, I think it's just the answer is simply it was just the context of what we were looking at here.
It totally makes sense. It's yeah, I think it was super interesting the extent to which cyclones did matter. Really nice.